The Young and the Restless spoilers. On the dark stretch of road leading out of Genoa City, the world seemed to shrink down to the cramped interior of Nick's car. The dashboard glow and the relentless hum of the engine, the only things grounding him in reality as Matt's hands tightened around his throat from the back seat. It was supposed to be a controlled confrontation, a dangerous but calculated move in a long line of risky decisions meant to protect his family. But the second Matt's arm hooked under Nick's jaw and the constriction cut into his airway, the situation slipped out of control in a way that felt brutally final. Nick felt the first shock of panic as a physical rush, a burst of heat and cold racing across his skin at the same time. His brain trying to juggle two impossible tasks, keep the car from veering off the road at high speed and somehow break free from the grip that was methodically crushing his windpipe. The night outside offered no mercy. The road was nearly empty, no headlights in the rearview mirror, no oncoming traffic. Just the endless dark pressing in against the glass and swallowing any hope that someone might pass by, see the struggle through the windshield, and intervene. Every instinct in him screamed to rip Matt's hands away and fight back with everything he had. But the brutal truth was that if he loosened his grip on the steering wheel for more than a second, the car would become a weapon, spinning into the barrier or plunging into some unseen ditch, ending not only his life but handing Matt a ready-made excuse that it had been an accident all along. Matt counted on chaos, on fear, on the natural human urge to thrash and flail and lose control, and Nick knew it. That awareness became a thin, fragile anchor that kept him from panicking completely as his vision began to fray at the edges. His lungs burned with each shallow, useless gasp, a horrible scraping sensation of air that never quite made it where it needed to go. And his ears filled with a high-pitched ringing that almost drowned out the sound of Matt's low, steady breathing behind him, the eerie calm of a man who believed he had already won. The car's speedometer hovered dangerously high, the vehicle cutting through the night like a bullet, and Nick forced himself to focus on the rhythm of the lines on the road, counting them, using them as a metronome to measure the seconds slipping through his fingers as he tried to execute the impossible, easing his foot off the gas, hovering it over the brake, tapping just enough to slow the car without jerking it so violently that Matt's grip tightened further in reflex. His fingers were starting to go numb, an ugly prickling sensation crawling up his forearms as blood flow and oxygen both started to falter. But he clung to the steering wheel like it was the last solid thing in his life, refusing to surrender to the dizzy blackness that kept threatening to swallow him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a parade of faces flashed past: Sharon, Noah, Faith, Christian. The image of them receiving a midnight phone call about a wreck on some desolate road and being told that he had died alone in the dark. That vision fueled a stubborn, furious surge of will inside him, a refusal to let Matt be the one who decided how his story ended. He eased the car into a gradual deceleration, the engine's roar dipping to a strained growl as the speedometer crept down, but Matt felt the change and responded with vicious precision, tightening his hold and pulling back harder, forcing Nick's head into an awkward angle that sent a white-hot bolt of pain through his neck. Spots of light exploded across his field of vision, like someone had flung a handful of stars directly at his eyes, and his hands shook on the wheel, knuckles white as they fought to keep the vehicle pinned between the lane markers. The road curved slightly, a subtle bend that suddenly felt like a cliff edge, and Nick used the last of his clarity to guide the car through it, inching his foot down on the brake with agonizing restraint so that the deceleration remained smooth, manageable, survivable. The tires hissed against the asphalt, the forward momentum slowly bleeding away, but Matt refused to release him, his entire body weight now pressing forward into the chokehold, using Nick's weakening resistance as leverage. A cruel paradox took shape in those final moments of coherence. The closer the car came to stopping and safety, the closer Nick drifted toward unconsciousness and whatever fate awaited him when he could no longer fight back at all. The world narrowed to a tunnel of sound and sensation, the muffled thud of his own heartbeat blasting through his skull, the pressure at his throat turning from sharp pain to a terrifying numbness that felt like his body giving up on sending signals. His hands slipped slightly on the wheel, sweat and weakness combining into a slick treachery that he barely corrected in time as the car drifted toward the shoulder. With one last, desperate act of control, he managed to ease down on the brake hard enough to bring the car to a lurching halt at the side of the road, the nose dipping as the forward motion died. The engine idling with a strained rattle that sounded almost impatient, like the machine itself couldn't believe it was being forced to stop. For a fraction of a second, there was an eerie stillness inside the car, a suspended, weightless instant in which Nick's body hung between fight and surrender, his mind half faded and his muscles trembling on the edge of collapse. Then the darkness verged over him in a final, suffocating wave. His hands slid from the wheel, his body sagged forward, and his consciousness snapped loose, sending him tumbling into a silent void where there were no roads, no enemies, no decisions left to make. Matt felt the shift immediately, the sudden dead weight beneath his arm, and he let go, watching with cold detachment as Nick slumped over the steering wheel, his chest heaving in shallow, uncertain spasms that may or may not have been breaths. For a moment, Matt just studied him in the dim light, as if committing the image to memory, measuring the success of what he had done. And then a different instinct kicked in: survival. He knew the plan Victor and Nick had been building around him, the trap they intended to spring, the way they had used money, threats, and their own version of justice to box him into a corner. This was his counterstrike, his own brutal rewrite of the script. If Nick was dead, it solved one problem. If he was not, the devastation and suspicion that followed would tear through the Newman family like a storm. Either way, Matt no longer intended to be the one tied up in a basement answering questions. With quick, efficient motions, he reached past the unconscious man, flicked off the headlights to plunge the car deeper into darkness, and then shoved the door open. The night air rushing in cold and empty. The road remained deserted, a ribbon of shadow stretching in both directions with no help in sight, and Matt slipped out into it like a ghost, closing the door just enough that it latched softly instead of slamming. He glanced once over his shoulder at the unmoving figure in the driver's seat, then turned away and began to move down the roadside, disappearing into the night with the kind of practiced stealth that suggested this was not the first time he had walked away from wreckage he had created. While Nick's fate hung in that fragile limbo on the side of the road, another car carved its own path through the darkness miles away, carrying Victor, Adam, and Annie toward a very different kind of reckoning. Inside that vehicle, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken agendas and simmering tension. A different sort of violence drawn not from hands around a throat, but from decisions made in cold blood and checked against a lifetime of ruthless logic. Victor's eyes, set forward on the road, held the weight of a man who believed in controlling chaos by any means necessary, and in his view, tonight was not about legality or moral debate. It was about closing the jaws of a trap he had set for two people who had come far too close to his family. Annie sat in the back seat, the leather cold beneath her hands, her mind racing through every choice that had led her here. She had stepped into this mess believing she could manage Matt, that she could play both sides long enough to secure her own safety or even tilt the balance of power. But the Newmans did not tolerate ambiguity, and they certainly did not reward divided loyalty. The destination Victor had chosen said everything: a hidden bunker, a place closed off from the world, where what happened could not be easily undone or even proven. He intended to put Annie and Matt in the same cage, to strip them of control, to demand the truth on his terms and administer punishment without the delays and loopholes of courts or deals. Beside him, Adam wrestled with his own shifting loyalties, torn between the brutal efficiency of his father's plan and a nagging sense that crossing certain lines only guaranteed that similar violence would one day loop back around on them. He knew about the attack on Nick's life only in the abstract, as a series of escalating threats and near misses that had pushed his brother deeper into this dangerous game. But he did not know, in this moment, that Matt had already made his move in the most visceral way possible. To Victor, Annie was a necessary piece on the board, someone who could lead them to Matt, someone who had touched the edges of the darkness they were trying to shut down. Locking her in a bunker with him was not just about interrogation. It was about forcing them to confront each other with no escape. letting fear and self-preservation pry open secrets that no lawyer or negotiator ever could. The silence inside the car was not empty. It was crowded with every wrong Matt had committed, every threat he had made, every time he had used the people Victor loved as leverage. The older man's jaw was clenched in that familiar way that signaled the choice had already been made, and any doubt would be crushed beneath the necessity of protecting his family. The irony, hanging sharp and bitter in the air like ozone before a storm, was that as Victor drove deeper toward this secret chamber he believed would restore control, the foundation of that control was already cracking in the darkness behind him, on that lonely stretch of road where Nick's life might be draining away unnoticed. Hours or even minutes would matter in ways no one had calculated. While Victor imagined a future where Matt and Annie were chained to chairs answering for their sins, reality had fractured off into something far more chaotic. Matt running loose into the night, potentially heading towards some new hiding place, some fresh act of retaliation, and Nick either clinging to life or already gone. His absence waiting to be discovered like a bomb no one knew they were standing on. Back at the roadside, the car sat like a discarded shell, engine humming faintly, bodywork catching only the faintest reflection of the moon. Inside, Nick's body remained slumped over, his face pressed at an angle that made it hard to tell from a distance whether he was simply unconscious or something worse. The air grew cooler as the night deepened, condensation beginning to bead on the windshield, and still no other vehicles appeared. The route, chosen earlier for its privacy and strategic isolation, now became a curse, converting secrecy into abandonment. Time stretched, a merciless thread that could either spin into a miraculous rescue or tighten into a noose. At the same time, threads elsewhere in Genoa City were starting to twitch. Eventually, someone would notice that Nick was not answering his phone, that he had not checked in, that the plan to deliver Matt into the underground chamber had suddenly gone quiet on one crucial end. Victor arriving at the bunker with Annie in tow and discovering that Matt never showed up, would not immediately suspect that his son lay potentially dying on the side of some empty road. His first impulse would be anger at a failed operation, suspicion that someone had tipped Matt off, fury at Annie if she so much as hesitated in answering his questions. The bunker itself, with its cold concrete walls and heavy doors, would become a stage where fear and desperation played out in ways that might be just as destructive as any physical attack. Because Victor's version of control, once threatened, tended to turn merciless. Annie, confronted with the realization that whatever deal she thought she had is unraveling, might finally break down and reveal details she had held back, secret meeting points, backup plans, rumors of safe houses or associates lurking at the edges of this ugly conflict. Adam, pacing at the edges of the room or watching from a corner, would feel the unease burrowing deeper as he tried to reconcile this grim reality with the idea of justice they claimed to be seeking. All the while, the question his father refused to consider in that first furious wave would begin to claw its way into the conversation. Why was Nick silent? Why had he not called to confirm the handoff? Why had he gone dark at the exact moment they expected him to have the upper hand? That question would start as a passing concern, then harden into something colder, more terrifying, as calls went to voicemail. As timestamps on last messages revealed a gap that could not be explained by delays or detours. At some point, someone would trace his route, send a car crawling back along the road he had taken, and headlights would eventually sweep over the outline of his abandoned vehicle. The discovery that followed would not just be about whether Nick was breathing, whether a pulse could be found, whether emergency services could still make a difference. It would be a shattering realization that this war with Matt had slipped beyond even Victor's ability to script and control, that their enemy had already drawn blood in the most personal way possible, and that every choice made from this point forward would be filtered through grief, guilt, and rage. The entire landscape of the conflict would shift. If Nick survived, scarred and shaken, the Newmans would become even more relentless, possibly crossing lines they had previously hesitated at, and the bunker that was meant to contain to enemies might instead become the birthplace of a darker, more vengeful campaign. If he did not survive, the fallout would be even more brutal, fracturing alliances, exposing every questionable decision that led him into that car with Matt in the first place, and leaving everyone from Victor to Adam to Annie scrambling to decide how much responsibility they were willing to admit. For now, though, all of that remained unwritten, hanging in a suspended moment between night and dawn. On one lonely road, a man lay motionless inside a car, caught between life and death. In another direction, his father steered toward a hidden chamber, believing he still held the reins of this dangerous game. Somewhere in the darkness between them, Matt moved unseen, carrying with him the knowledge that he had just changed everything. And until the first light of morning or the first siren cut through the silence, no one truly knew the answer to the only question that mattered. Had Nick Newman just slipped out of their world forever? Or was he out there somewhere, fighting his way back from the edge, ready to wake up to a war that would look very different from the one he thought he was controlling tonight? Dawn did not arrive gently over Genoa City. It seeped in with a gray, exhausted light that felt more like an interrogation lamp than a sunrise, exposing everything that had been hidden in the night. Starting with the abandoned car on the side of the road. The officer who finally spotted it was not looking for a Newman vehicle. He was simply finishing a long, dull patrol shift, eyes scanning for anything out of place, when the odd angle of the car, half on the shoulder and half still nose toward the lane, tucked his attention away from the monotony. At first, it looked like any other roadside breakdown, another driver too tired to make it home who had dozed off after pulling over. But as he slowed and rolled closer, the engine's faint idle and the stillness inside the cabin struck him as wrong in a way that made the hairs at the back of his neck stir. He parked behind it, lights still off, climbed out, and approached with the cautious routine of someone who had seen too many things go sideways in the quiet hours before sunrise. The windows were fogged just enough to blur the interior, but through the haze he could make out a shape slumped over the steering wheel, unmoving. His heart rate kicked up as he rapped on the glass and got no response, then tried the door handle and felt it give under his hand. The sound of the door opening cut through the morning stillness, and the reality of the situation rushed up at him in a single, brutal image. A man half collapsed against the wheel, skin pale, neck bearing the livid marks of violent pressure, breath shallow and ragged if they were present at all. Training took over where shock tried to intrude. He radioed for immediate medical support and backup, voice clipped and urgent, as his fingers moved to check for any sign of life. There was a pulse, thready and weak, a fragile flicker beneath fingertips that felt suddenly too clumsy and human for the stakes they were handling. And he held onto that small, stubborn rhythm as if he could will it stronger by sheer focus. The name on the driver's license in the wallet confirmed what instinct already suspected once he saw the face more clearly. Nicholas Newman. That single fact transformed the scene from a near tragedy into a potential explosion, because nothing involving a Newman stayed contained for long. While the officer worked to keep Nick breathing, an ambulance tore through the waking city, sirens cracking open the early morning quiet and forcing a path toward the roadside. Paramedics descended, their motions swift and practiced, securing oxygen, stabilizing his neck, checking his airway. Reading the story written across his skin in bruises that wrapped his throat like a pair of invisible hands. Their conversation was brisk, clinical, but even beneath that professional tone, there was an undercurrent of unease. This was no ordinary car accident. There were no skid marks on the road, no broken glass, no crumpled metal or obvious sign of collision. Only the eerie stillness of a car that had simply stopped and a man whose body told a tale of deliberate violence. They strapped him to the gurney, loaded him into the ambulance, and sped back toward the hospital. One of them already thinking ahead to the questions that would come once the last name Newman reached the wrong ears. Who had done this? Where? And why had no one known until now? At almost the same moment that the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle peeled away from the scene, deep beneath an unmarked structure outside the city, Victor stood in the bunker with his arms crossed, ice colder than the concrete around him as he regarded Annie with a gaze that had broken stronger people than her. Hours had passed in tension and interrogation, his patience thinning with every hedged answer. every claimed gap in knowledge about Matt's fallback plans. The room still smelled faintly of dust and old metal, the air heavy with the echo of raised voices. Though Annie herself had long since run out of the energy to raise hers against the pressure bearing down on her. Adam hovered nearby, half participant, half witness, his own frustrations sharpening with every minute that slipped by without contact from Nick. The original plan had been simple enough in theory. Nick and Matt's confrontation would end with Matt contained, physically delivered, or at least tracked. And then Victor would close the book on this threat with the ruthless efficiency he prided himself on. Instead, they had one captive, one missing enemy, and one son whose phone went to voicemail no matter how many times they tried. At first, Victor chalked it up to delays, complications, even the possibility that Nick was exercising caution. Then the timestamps began to speak a different truth. The last message from Nick had been sent much earlier in the night, and there had been nothing since not a call, not a text, not even a brief update relayed through some mutual contact. Adam pointed it out quietly, almost reluctantly, because voicing the concern made it real in a way that shifted the weight of the room, turning tension into dread. Victor's jaw tightened, that familiar armor sliding into place, but even he could not completely ignore the chill that crept up his spine. In the silence that followed, the bunker no longer felt like a place of control. It felt like a trap they had built for others that might now be snapping shut around their own feet. Annie watched this shift with a morbid awareness that the balance of power in the room might be pivoting. She knew more than she had admitted, not because she had been trying to outsmart Victor, but because fear had made her cling to the idea that holding onto certain details might buy her a way out later, some negotiating chip in a world where every ally could become a captor overnight. Now, with Nick missing and Matt unaccounted for, those hidden details felt less like protection and more like explosives strapped to her chest. If Nick was in trouble, if this whole plan had gone catastrophically wrong, then Victor's capacity for mercy hedge was already questionable at best would evaporate completely. The questions would sharpen into accusations, and she would be pressed until something broke. Somewhere between the fourth unanswered call and the visible flicker of calculation in Victor's eyes, Adam made a decision of his own. He stepped out of the immediate line of his father's interrogation, pulling out his phone and directing his energy not at Annie, but at the world outside these underground walls. He started making calls beyond the family network people in security, contacts with access to traffic cameras, patrol logs, anything that could tell them if Nick's car had been spotted after leaving the known route. As information trickled back in fragments, a rough picture began to form. Nick's vehicle had been recorded on a highway camera around the time he was supposed to be ferrying Matt toward the drop point. But there was no subsequent footage of the car arriving anywhere near their intended destination. It was as if he had vanished between one stretch of road and the next. Victor listened to these updates with an expression that seemed carved from stone, but under the surface, memories he rarely allowed himself to dwell unstirred. Memories of other nights when he had received sudden, devastating news about people he loved, and of how often that news had been tangled up with his own choices, his own ruthless gambles.